There are mornings that arrive quietly, the kind that offer no warning, no signal, no hint that the hours ahead will be anything other than ordinary. This was one of those mornings. At least that was how it appeared on the surface. The Cascade Ridge, mountains of northern Montana, don't soften themselves for winter. They don't ease you in with gentle frosts or polite dips in temperature. When winter comes to Cascade Ridge, it arrives like an occupation, total, uncompromising, and indifferent to any plans you might have had. Snow doesn't fall there so much as it accumulates with a kind of grim determination, burying fence posts, swallowing roads, and rewriting the landscape into something that even lifelong residents sometimes struggle to recognize. On the morning of January the 9th, the thermometer outside the window of an old stone and timber cabin on the eastern edge of Cascade Ridge read 11 degrees below zero. That's not a number that invites philosophical reflection. That's a number that demands action. It tells you to stay inside, stay warm, and be grateful for walls and fire, and a roof that holds. Retired Detective Sergeant Marcus Cole had no intention of going outside that morning. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered but moving more carefully these days, with a face that had weathered 3 decades of difficult work and emerged with the particular character that comes from having seen too much and still choosing to care. He had served 29 years with the Montana State Police, the last 12 as a lead detective specializing in organized crime. He had retired 2 years ago, not entirely by choice. His knee had made certain decisions on his behalf, and had settled into this cabin on Cascade Ridge with the intention of doing very little for a very long time. The cabin had been his father's. Then it had sat empty for 12 years while Marcus was too busy and too far away and too consumed by the work to deal with the practicalities of claiming it. When he finally retired and drove up that winding mountain road with a truck full of boxes and a bad knee, he found the place in disrepair but structurally sound, which felt like a reasonable metaphor for his own condition. He had spent the first 6 months fixing it up. The next year and a half, he had simply lived in it. He made coffee every morning at 5:45. Strong black, no ceremony. He read history mostly, and the occasional crime novel that he found simultaneously relaxing and professionally infuriating. He took walks when the weather permitted and sat by the fire when it didn't. He called his daughter Nora in Bozeman every Sunday without fail, and resisted politely but firmly every suggestion that he should move somewhere with more people nearby. He was not lonely. That was important to him to understand about himself. He was solitary, which is a different condition entirely. Loneliness is absence. Solitude is a choice. Marcus Cole had made his choice and was at peace with it. At least he had been until the morning of January the 9th. He was at the kitchen table with his first coffee, the fire behind him in the living room, throwing a comfortable warmth through the cabin when he heard it, or thought he heard it, a sound so faint against the howling of the wind that his first instinct was to dismiss it as the building shifting in the cold, something old structures do in extreme temperatures, settling and contracting, and making sounds that could be mistaken for almost anything. But Marcus Cole had spent 3 decades in the business of not ignoring things that seemed insignificant. That professional reflex had saved his life on 2 documented occasions and an unknown number of undocumented ones. So instead of refilling his coffee mug and opening his book, he set both down on the table and listened. There it was, unmistakable now that he was paying attention. A thin, reedy sound. Not the wind, not the building, not the fire. Something alive. Something small and desperate, fighting to be heard over the roar of a winter storm that had no interest in accommodating it. Marcus stood, crossed to the front door, and opened it. The cold came in like a physical force, pressing against him with 11 degrees below zero conviction. Snow swirled up from the porch boards in tiny cyclones. Marcus braced against the doorframe and looked down. 2 puppies lay curled against the base of his front door. Brown and white, maybe 8. Weeks old at the outside, pressed together in a bundle so tight that it took a second to distinguish where one ended and the other began. Their fur was stiff with ice. The snow had drifted up around them on 3 sides, almost burying them entirely. And their breathing, he could see it, barely. Shallow, rapid movements of rib cages the size of his fist was the thin, unsteady breathing of bodies that are running critically low on everything they need to stay alive. Marcus Cole had seen a great deal of terrible things in his career. He was not easily affected, but the sight of those 2 small animals fighting to survive in a sub-zero Snowdrift on his front porch hit him somewhere below the armor of professional detachment, somewhere that hadn't been touched in a while. He reached down, gathered them both in his arms. They were heartbreakingly light, both of them together barely more than what a newborn baby weighs, and stepped back inside. The door swung shut behind him, and everything changed. Chapter 1. Keeping them alive. Marcus didn't panic. Panicking was not in his behavioral repertoire and never had been. What he did instead was move, deliberately, methodically, drawing on a mental resource catalog that 29 years in high-pressure situations had built up with considerable thoroughness. He carried the puppies to the living room and set them carefully on the floor in front of the fireplace, close enough for warmth but not so close that the sudden heat would shock their systems. He had enough basic knowledge of hypothermia, from training, from a couple of wilderness search and rescue incidents he'd been involved in over the years, to know that rewarming too fast was as dangerous as the cold itself. He retrieved 2 thick wool blankets from the bedroom chest, wrapped each puppy, separately first, then together, creating a bundle that could retain heat while the external source did its work gradually. He added 2 more logs to the fire, bringing it up to a steady, significant burn. He filled 2 rubber hot water bottles. He kept them as a matter of personal habit. They were useful in an old cabin with temperamental heating. Wrapped each in a layer of flannel and tucked them against the blanket bundle, one on each side, not touching the puppies directly, buffers. Then he got on the floor. This took more effort than it once had, courtesy of the knee and various other indignities of age, but he managed it without particular grace and positioned himself cross-legged, beside the bundle, close enough to monitor it constantly. He opened the blanket every few minutes to check their breathing, to feel whether their core temperature was improving, to assess whether they were responding for the first 20 minutes. The situation felt extremely uncertain. Their breathing remained too shallow, their bodies too still. The smaller of the 2, he was already mentally distinguishing them. The smaller was pale brown with a white chest. The larger was darker with irregular white patches, made a sound at some point around the 15-minute mark that was less a whimper than an exhalation, barely audible, and Marcus felt something constrict in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. At 30 minutes, the larger puppy moved. Not dramatically, just a small shift, a reorientation of the body, a pulling of limbs inward in the involuntary way that signals the nervous system is beginning to come back online. Marcus exhaled slowly. At 45 minutes, the smaller puppy's breathing deepened perceptibly, from the shallow, rapid flutter of a body in crisis to something slower and more substantial. Marcus noted this with the same quiet precision with which he had once noted the turning points in difficult interrogations. This was a turning point. At just past 7 a.m., the larger puppy opened its eyes. They were dark, unfocused at first, the eyes of a creature waking from something that had been very close to permanent sleep. They moved around the room with the disoriented, searching quality of someone trying to establish where and what and whether it was safe. Then they found Marcus's face and stopped. Held there, the puppy blinked twice slowly. "Good morning," Marcus said quietly. His voice was level and even, the way he had learned to speak to people in distress. Not loud, not coaxing, just present. Just there. The puppy's ears, which had been flat against its head, lifted slightly. A good sign. 10 minutes after that, the smaller puppy stirred, stretched one tiny leg with enormous effort, and produced a sound that was unmistakably a yawn. Marcus looked at it for a moment, then unexpectedly he laughed. It was a short, quiet sound somewhere, between relief and something he couldn't name, but it was genuine and it surprised him. "All right," he said, reaching to adjust the blanket around them both. "You made it, both of you. Good work." He got to his feet, carefully the knee, and went to call the nearest veterinarian. Chapter 2. The First Clue. Dr. Janet. Okafor ran the only veterinary practice within 40 miles of Cascade Ridge, operating out of a converted house in the small town of Ridgeline. She had been Marcus's K-9 unit's veterinarian years ago, when the department still ran dogs and the professional relationship had survived into civilian life with the comfortable ease of 2 people who respect each other's competence. She talked him through the next steps by phone. Keep the rewarming process going. Gradually, introduce small amounts of slightly warm water once they were fully conscious and responding, Watch for signs of respiratory distress or abnormal neurological behavior. She would come up to the cabin that afternoon to do a proper examination, road conditions permitting. Marcus thanked her, promised to call if anything changed, and returned to the living room. The puppies were both awake now, though not yet mobile. They lay in the blanket, bundled together, watching him with the complete attention quality that young animals have, that state of pure sensory absorption, cataloging everything. Marcus set up a makeshift warming station, a shallow cardboard box from the storage room, lined with blankets with the hot water bottles positioned around the exterior walls, creating a warm enclosure without direct heat contact. He moved the puppies into it and positioned the box equidistant from the fire and an auxiliary space heater he'd retrieved. For then he went to refill his coffee, because it had been 2 hours since he'd had any and he was beginning to feel it. It was when he returned with the mug, standing in the doorway between kitchen and living room taking the first sip, that he noticed the box. The same cardboard box he'd used to make the warming station. He'd grabbed it from the storage room without thinking, the way you grab any available container in an urgent situation. It was one of several boxes left over from his move, never fully sorted, sitting against the back wall of the storage room. Except, he looked more carefully now, this wasn't one of his boxes. His moving boxes were brown and uniformly labeled in his own handwriting: kitchen, books, paperwork. This box was darker, slightly damp from something, and bore no writing on any visible exterior surface. He had simply grabbed it in the dark of the storage room, without examining it, because in the urgency of the moment it had served an immediate purpose. How had it gotten into his storage room? He set his coffee down, crouched beside the box. The puppies watched him with mild interest, their small heads tracking his movement. On the underside of the left flap, the flap that would have been facing the wall when the box was stored, there was writing, not labeling, not his handwriting, a series of numbers written in black marker, grouped in clusters 4, 711, 2219 3, 844 2. Marcus stared at them for a long moment. His retired detective brain, which had never stopped being a detective brain regardless of his employment status, processed this with a calm efficiency that had nothing to do with not being alarmed. Numbers in clusters of 3, a common format for several things: coordinates, cipher, keys, page-line word references in a book code, or something else entirely. The point was that they were there, on a box that was not his, in his storage room, and someone had put them there. When? He stood and walked back to the storage room, this time with the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, examining it properly. The room was small and contained exactly what it had always contained: his own labeled boxes, a broken lamp he kept meaning to dispose of, winter equipment, tools. The storage room had a single small window set high in the wall that he had never opened since moving in. The window latch was undone. Marcus checked it carefully without touching the frame, old professional habit. The latch was the original hardware, stiff with age and rust, and it showed fresh scratch marks around the mechanism, consistent with it having been recently forced. Someone had come through that window recently, placed a box in his storage room, and then apparently left puppies on his front porch. He walked back to the living room and looked at the 2 small animals in their blanket nest. They looked back at him. The larger one attempted for the first time to stand up, got approximately halfway, and sat down again with an expression of mild personal affront. "I know," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to them. "I have questions too." Chapter 3. A detective returns to work. For a man who had spent 2 years trying very deliberately to leave the detective work behind, Marcus Cole slipped back into the investigative mindset with a smoothness that was both professionally gratifying and personally annoying. He documented everything. He had a camera, an old one, reliable, and he photographed the storage room window, the latch, the scratch marks, the box, the numbers on the flap, and the general layout of the room from multiple angles. For a man who had spent 2 years trying very deliberately to leave the detective work behind, Marcus Cole slipped back into the investigative mindset with a smoothness that was both professionally gratifying and personally annoying. He documented everything. He had a camera, an old one, reliable, and he photographed the storage room window, the latch, the scratch marks, the box, the numbers on the flap, and the general layout of the room from multiple angles. He did not touch anything he had not already touched, and he made a written record of everything he had touched and when. He sketched a rough map of the room and noted the position of the box before he moved it. Then he went outside. The cold was savage, but Marcus had dressed for it properly. Insulated coveralls, face, wrap, the serious boots that had been a retirement gift to himself. He circled the cabin, methodically, starting at the storage room window. There were tracks in the snow, partially filled in by the overnight storm, but not completely. The most recent snowfall had come earlier in the evening, and whoever had made these prints had done so after. The snow stopped. The tracks led from the tree line at the northeastern edge of his property, across the open ground behind the cabin to the storage window. Then, at a slightly different angle, they continued around the side of the cabin to the front porch, where the puppies had been left. He followed the outgoing tracks backward to the tree line and stopped. The trail disappeared into the forest on what appeared to be a rough path heading north-northeast, not a hiking trail, just a route someone had made through the trees by walking it repeatedly. The snow between the trail's trees was shallower due to the canopy, meaning the prints there were less filled in and more legible. Boot prints, heavy tread, size 12 by rough estimation, consistent throughout, one person moving, with purpose rather than wandering. Marcus stood at the tree line for a moment, looking north-northeast. In that direction, following the mountain's contour, there was nothing for several miles except forest, a seasonal hunting road that was impassable in winter, and beyond that, the old Branford Creek mining claims in a collection of defunct extraction operations from the 1980s and 90s that had been abandoned for decades. He knew the area. He had covered it in his patrol days once or twice. Nobody went up there anymore, particularly not in winter. Nobody without a reason. He returned to the cabin, made notes, and fed the puppies their first water, the larger. One accepted it readily, the smaller one with initial suspicion that dissolved into enthusiasm. They were both stronger now. The larger had successfully achieved standing on all four legs for approximately 8 seconds before sitting back down, which he had celebrated with a tail wag so vigorous it had toppled him sideways. Marcus observed this without expression, while making a note in his log that both animals were recovering well and demonstrating normal behavioral responses. He was aware that he was avoiding the larger question. The question of what the numbers meant, who had put a box in his storage room, and why they had left 2 puppies on his porch while doing so. He was avoiding it, not because he didn't know how to approach it. He knew exactly how, but because approaching it properly meant calling people, and calling people meant re-engaging with a world he had stepped back from. It meant acknowledging that his cabin on Cascade Ridge, his chosen refuge, his deliberately constructed solitude, had been selected as the location for something that involved him whether he wanted it to or not. He made another coffee. He watched the puppies. The larger one was chewing on a corner of the blanket with focused contentment. The smaller had fallen asleep again, pressed against its sibling with total trust. Marcus picked up his phone and called Frank DeRosa. Frank had been his lieutenant for 9 of his 12 years as a detective. He had retired 3 years before Marcus moved to Arizona and had been calling Marcus every month, or so ever since, with the cheerful stubbornness of someone who has decided a friendship is worth maintaining, regardless of distance. Marcus had sometimes not picked up when he saw the name. He always called back, "Marcus." Frank picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. He was always awake early. "What day is it?" "It's not Sunday." "It's not Sunday," Marcus agreed. "I need to run something by you, professionally." A pause. When Frank spoke again, the casual warmth was still there, but something sharper had moved behind it. "Go ahead," Marcus told him. "All of it. The puppies, the box, the window, the tracks, the numbers." He read the numbers out loud. 4711, 2219 3, 844 2. He heard Frank write them down. "The box," Frank said. "When do you think it was placed?" "Window was last opened before I moved in. I know that with reasonable confidence. I check those latches seasonally. That latch was secure in October. Someone came in between October and this morning. Could be months of lead time. Could be, or could be recent. I'd lean toward recent given the puppies. The puppies are connected to the box." "I believe so, yes." Another pause. "You know what those numbers could be? Several things. You know which thing I'm thinking. Marcus looked out the window at the white wall of snow on the far side of the glass. Radford Creek, he said. Quietly, friendship is worth maintaining, regardless of distance. Marcus had sometimes not picked up when he saw the name. He always called back. Marcus. Frank picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. He was always awake early. What day is it? It's not Sunday. It's not Sunday, Marcus agreed. I need to run something by you, professionally. A pause. When Frank spoke again, the casual warmth was still there, but something sharper had moved behind it. Go ahead, Marcus told him. All of it. The puppies, the box, the window, the tracks, the numbers. He read the numbers out loud. 4711, 2219 3, 844 2. He heard Frank write them down. The box, Frank said. When do you think it was placed? Window was last opened before I moved in. I know that with reasonable confidence. I check those latches seasonally. That latch was secure in October. Someone came in between October and this morning. Could be months of lead time. Could be, or could be recent. I'd lean toward recent given the puppies. The puppies are connected to the box. I believe so, yes. Another pause. You know what those numbers could be? Several things. You know which thing I'm thinking. Marcus looked out the window at the white wall of snow on the far side of the glass. Radford Creek, he said quietly. Radford Creek, Frank confirmed. 10 years ago, Marcus had worked the edge of an investigation, technically federal jurisdiction, but with enough interstate threads that the state police had been involved, in a supporting capacity, involving a network of operations running out of the old mining claims area. The network had been sophisticated, patient, and deeply careful about evidence. After 18 months of work by multiple agencies, the investigation had produced 3 arrests of peripheral figures and absolutely nothing on the central organizing structure. The case had been classified as open suspended, officially active, practically dormant. The numbers on that box, Marcus now believed, were a book code reference. The question was which book, and the question behind that question was who had known to leave them specifically in his storage room in his cabin on a mountain where he had come to be forgotten. Someone found you, Frank said, reading his silence accurately. Someone found me, Marcus agreed. The question is what they're trying to tell me. He looked at the puppies. The smaller one had woken up and was watching him again, with that focused, evaluating attention that he had already come to associate with it. Smart, he thought. Whatever they'd been through, these two were alert and paying attention to the world around them. He had the feeling, strong and professional and fully formed, that they had been brought to him specifically, not abandoned, delivered, by someone who was running out of time and out of options and had decided that an old detective on a mountain was their best chance. He just needed to figure out who and why, and whether there was still time to help. Chapter 4, The Dogs Get Names. Dr. Okafor arrived at 3:15 in the afternoon, driving the 4-wheel drive truck. She kept specifically for winter calls in the high country. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair, efficient movements, and an absolutely no-nonsense approach to animal welfare that Marcus had always respected. She examined both puppies with thorough professionalism, checking their eyes, ears, reflexes, temperature, heart rate, and hydration. She prodded their abdomens gently, assessed their limbs, looked at their teeth to confirm age. She made notes. Then she sat, back on her heels, and looked at Marcus. They're in remarkably good condition given what you described, she said. Core temperature is back in normal range. No signs of frostbite anywhere significant. There's some superficial damage on the ear tips, nothing that won't heal. Reflexes are normal, hydration is adequate. She paused. You did the right things. I had good instructions. She gave him a look that suggested she thought this was excessive modesty. These animals are approximately 7 to 8 weeks old. They're a shepherd retriever cross. By the look of them, maybe some husky in there. They should be eating solid puppy food. At this point, she produced 2 cans of puppy food from her bag. Start with small, amounts 4 times daily. Don't let them overeat. Their systems need to readjust. She also produced a small medical kit, syringes, a bottle of puppy vitamins in liquid form, daily vitamin supplement in their water. They're somewhat undernourished, not critically, But whoever had these animals hasn't been maintaining them well for at least the last week. Marcus noted this. Undernourished for a week. So they weren't cared for, or their caretaker was no longer in a position to care for them properly, Janet said, with the pragmatic precision of someone who has seen many difficult situations, different from negligence. Something happened. He showed her the box and the numbers. She looked at them without touching, the way someone does when they understand the implicit instruction not to. You're going back in, aren't you? She said. Not quite a question. I'm looking into some things. She studied him for a moment. Janet Okafor was not a woman who made speeches. Be careful, she said. And name those dogs. Animals that don't have names are easier to lose. She left at 4 o'clock. Marcus stood in the cabin doorway after the sound of her truck faded into the distance, looking at the 2 puppies in their blanket nest. They looked back at him with the cheerful availability of creatures who have no idea they were almost dead 12 hours ago and have already moved on to considering what's interesting about the present moment. He thought about it for a while, the naming question. He was a methodical thinker and did not make arbitrary decisions. The larger one, darker, bolder, with that slightly absurd enthusiasm for standing up. Repeatedly, despite limited success, he named Case, because it was clear this animal was going to be a project. The smaller one, the paler brown with the white chest, the one with the watching eyes, and the considered, intelligent way of taking in its surroundings, he named Ridge, for Cascade Ridge, for the mountain that had somehow drawn both of them here. Case and Ridge, he said aloud, testing it. Case thumped his tail on the blanket. Ridge watched him with the expression of someone assessing whether this was a reasonable decision. Marcus decided to take that as acceptance. He fed them their first solid food that evening, small portions, 4 times through the afternoon and evening, precisely as instructed. Case ate with the anarchic enthusiasm of someone who has never encountered anything as fundamentally excellent as food. Ridge ate carefully, methodically, pausing to look around between bites in a way that somehow communicated both appetite and situational awareness simultaneously. By the time darkness had fully settled over the mountain at 7 p.m., both puppies were asleep in their nest again, warm and fed and breathing with the easy, unguarded rhythm of animals no longer in distress. Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the number, sequence written on a piece of paper in front of him and thought about books. Book codes required a shared text. The sender and receiver both had to have the same edition of the same book. The numbers corresponded to page, line, and word, or some variation of that format. Without knowing the text, the code was unbreakable. He considered who might have sent this. Who knew where he lived, who knew he had this cabin, who knew enough about him to choose this location. The list of people from his old working life who had that information was not long. He thought about which of them might be in a situation requiring coded communication, delivered physically, rather than digitally via a window that required forcing. Someone who couldn't use a phone or a computer. Someone who couldn't be traceable. Someone who was hiding. And he thought about the book. The shared text, whatever it was, would have to be something both parties possessed. Something unusual enough not to be random, specific enough to be intentional. Marcus got up and went to his bookshelf. His books, most of them. He ran his finger along the spine slowly, reading titles, thinking. His father's books were here mixed in. With his own, he'd kept them when he claimed the cabin. Had never gotten around to separating them. He stopped at a particular spine. An old one, cloth binding, faded red. He pulled it out. His father had given him a copy of this book when Marcus had first joined the force. A gesture of encouragement, or perhaps of warning. It was hard to tell with his father, who had been a man of considered silences. He had given the same book to exactly one other person that Marcus knew of. His fingers found the first number cluster. Page 4, line 7. Word 11. He opened to page 4, counted down 7 lines, counted across to the 11th word. The word was north. Marcus sat very still. Then he turned to page 22. Chapter 5. The code breaks open. Page 22, line 19, word 3, road. Page 8, line 44. He had to count carefully. The lines were dense. Word 2, old. North, road, old. Marcus set the book down on the table and stared at the 3 words. He said them to himself twice quietly in sequence. North road, old. Old road, north. Old north road. The old north road. It wasn't on any current map. It had been decommissioned as a public thoroughfare in Wells when the mining operations in the area finally shuttered for the last time. But it existed. A gravel track, barely maintained, running north through the forest from a junction near the base of Cascade Ridge, passing the old Branford Creek mine complex, and continuing another 4 miles to what had once been a series of processing facilities, now long since stripped and abandoned. He had driven it twice in his career, impassable, in winter without serious four-wheel drive capability and significant preparation, but someone had told him to look at the Old North Road, and someone had brought him 2 puppies to make sure he found the code, and that someone he was increasingly certain was a person he had not spoken to in almost 5 years, a former confidential informant named Thomas Breck, who had disappeared into a witness protection arrangement after providing pivotal but ultimately insufficient testimony in the Branford Creek investigation, an arrangement that was supposed to be permanent and invisible. If Thomas Breck had found a way to send him a message through a book code in a cabin on a mountain, it meant one of 2 things. Either the arrangement had failed and Breck was exposed and running, or Breck had found something significant enough to risk his own protection to communicate. Neither option was comfortable. Marcus sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Behind him in the living room, he could hear the soft sounds of Case and Ridge shifting in their blanket nest, the occasional small thump of a tail, the breathing of sleeping animals. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had eased and the mountain was very quiet. He called Frank back. 3 words, he said when Frank picked up. North Road Old, as in the Old North Road up here. A silence that conveyed a great deal. You think it's Breck? I think it's Breck. Marcus, Frank's voice took on a quality he recognized. The tone of someone who is, about to say something they know won't be received well. This is a federal matter. If Breck is compromised, if that's what this is, then the right call is to contact the marshal's office and let them handle. If the marshal's office had handled it, Breck wouldn't be leaving coded messages in my storage room. Marcus's voice was even, not argumentative. Just factual. Whatever's happening, it hasn't been addressed through official channels. That means either those channels are compromised or they've been bypassed for a reason. Either way, someone thought I was the better option. A long pause. What are you planning to do? Drive up the Old North Road tomorrow morning. Look around. You're 61 years old with a bad knee. I'm aware of both those facts. You're alone on a mountain. I'll take the dogs. Another pause, longer this time. Frank said, I'll call you at 9 tomorrow morning. If you don't pick up, I'm calling search and rescue. Marcus agreed to this condition, partly because Frank would do it regardless of whether Marcus agreed, and partly because it was not unreasonable. He ended the call and sat with the book in his hands, his father's old copy, A History of Mountain Law, Enforcement in the American West, practical and unsentimental and apparently now, operating as a cipher key, and thought about the distances involved, both geographical and personal. Thomas Breck had been 26 years old when Marcus had worked with him. Small, nervous, fiercely intelligent, with the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage. From the outside, the quiet, grinding courage of someone doing the right thing when it costs them everything. He had testified truthfully and carefully and had been systematically failed by a prosecution that couldn't get the central case to hold. He had entered protection and disappeared. Wherever he had been for 5 years, something had changed. Something had made him run, and he had run here. Marcus closed the book, got up, and went to check on the puppies. Both awake, looking at him, tails moving. He crouched beside the nest and rested his hands on them in turn, feeling the warmth and solidity of small, living, recovering animals. You two, he said quietly, are going to need to stay inside tomorrow. Chapter 6, The Old North Road. He left at first light. The temperature had climbed marginally overnight, 5 below, 0 rather than 11, a mercy. He loaded the truck with standard winter emergency kit, chains already on the tires, a second spare, flares, emergency blankets, a first aid kit, food and water for 3 days, his old service weapon that he had kept legal and licensed, and a satellite communicator that could send GPS positions to Frank, regardless of cell coverage. He left Case and Ridge in the cabin, which they objected to with considerable vocal force, as he closed the door. He had set up a larger box with high sides, lined it thoroughly, with blankets, left water and food within reach, and positioned the space heater at a safe angle. They would be fine for several hours. They were not under this impression and communicated it loudly. The truck handled the road with effort. The snow was deep, but the vehicle was built for conditions exactly like this, and Marcus drove carefully, reading the surface, keeping his speed measured. The Old North Road junction came after 6 miles on the main mountain highway, a break in the tree line that you would miss entirely if you weren't looking for it, marked by a weather-blasted wooden post with no current signage. He turned in. The road hadn't been maintained in decades, but the basic surface held gravel and hard mountain earth packed down over years of mining traffic, now under 2 feet of snow. He drove slowly, watching the tree line on both sides. Nothing moved. The forest was absolutely still in the way that deep winter forests are. Everything conserving. Energy, waiting. 3 miles in, he saw the smoke. Not the heavy black smoke of a fire out of control, but a thin, pale column rising from somewhere behind a cluster of pines to the east of the road. The controlled, deliberate smoke of a small fire being carefully managed. Marcus stopped the truck, cut the engine, and sat for a moment assessing. Then he got out. He moved into the trees at an angle to the smoke source, keeping low, moving slowly, and quietly in the way that does not come naturally in heavy winter gear, but can be accomplished with discipline. He circled wide, coming around to approach the smoke, from the north rather than the roadside. The source was a small stone structure, part of the old mine infrastructure. A pumping station or equipment shelter, perhaps 12 feet by 15 with a rusted metal roof that had held against the years. The door was recently repaired with new wood, clearly, salvaged from somewhere. Smoke came from a stovepipe in the roof, through a gap in a boarded window. Faint orange light was visible. Marcus stood in the trees, watching. No other footprints in the immediate area, no vehicle. One set of boot prints from the structure door to the woodpile against the south wall and back. He stepped forward, moved to the door, and knocked. 3 times. Then 2, a pattern. From a long time ago. A protocol that only meant something to one person besides him. A silence. Then movement from inside. Then a voice rough with disuse and something else, something like relief barely controlled. "Marcus?" "It's me," he said. "Open the door." Thomas Breck looked older than 31. He looked like a man who had been under sustained pressure for a long time and had been managing it alone. He had lost weight. His face was sharp in ways that spoke of both cold and stress. But his eyes were still the same, that particular intelligence, watchful and precise, that had made him valuable as an informant and that Marcus had always thought privately deserved a better life than the one the circumstances had provided. He let Marcus in without a word. The inside of the small structure was basic, but functional: a wood stove burning low, a sleeping setup, a packed canned food stacked neatly against one wall. Signs of someone who has been here for a while and has organized for the long term. Marcus sat on the wooden crate that served as the only chair. Thomas sat on the bedroll, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, looking at Marcus the way someone looks at a person they had hoped would come and had not been certain would start from the beginning. Marcus said all of it. Chapter 7. Thomas Breck's Story. He had been living as David Park in Missoula, a cover identity the marshals had constructed carefully. Employment history, rental record, a modest life building toward something normal. He had worked in logistics, stayed away from anything that could attract attention, had learned to be invisible in the unremarkable way that most people are invisible in medium-sized cities. Not happy exactly, but stable, safe. 8 months ago, someone had made him. He didn't know how. That was the worst part. Not knowing whether it was a surveillance slip, a data breach, a coincidence, or something more deliberate. What he knew was that one morning in May, he had gone to his car in the parking garage outside his apartment and found a photograph on his windshield. A photograph of himself, taken from a distance on a street he walked regularly. No message, no demand, just the photograph. He had called his contact in the marshal's service, left 3 messages over a week. Nobody called back. He had been given a secondary emergency contact, a different number, for use only in the most critical situations. He had called that one. Also, no answer. He had done everything the protocol required. The protocol had produced nothing. That was when he understood that he was on his own. He had left Missoula with 36 hours of preparation, withdrew cash, left his Apartment appearing occupied, took nothing that could be traced. He had moved twice. Since then, staying in isolated areas, buying time while he tried to understand what had happened and what to do next. He had no way of knowing whether his protection had simply failed administratively or whether something more deliberate had compromised it. What he did know, and this was why he had made his way to Cascade Ridge, this was what he needed to communicate, was what he had found 4 months ago while hiding in the old mine complex above the old North Road. He had been exploring the structures, looking for usable shelter, and in the deepest level of the old Branford Creek main shaft, a section that should have been sealed, that appeared sealed from the outside, he had found an active operation. Not mining, record storage. Specifically, a significant archive of physical documents, hard drives, and material evidence from the operation that the investigation 10 years ago had never been able to fully document. Someone had been maintaining this cache, securing it, adding to it. The kind of archive that sophisticated criminal organizations maintain as insurance, evidence of wrongdoing by people in positions of authority, documentation of corruption, records of payments. The kind of material that could destroy careers and prosecutions and freedom for a great many people who currently believed they were safe. Thomas had taken photographs. Careful ones, systematic, the way Marcus had taught him years ago to document scenes properly. He had a memory card with over 300 images organized by date and category, showing materials that would constitute the most significant breakthrough in the Branford Creek investigation in its entire history. He had tried to figure out who to give them to. The federal contacts he had once trusted were unreachable or worse, potentially compromised. If his protection had been deliberately burned, then someone with access to that system had been involved, and that meant federal-level exposure. He needed someone outside the existing chain, someone with the experience to understand what the evidence meant, the credibility to present it properly, and the personal integrity that he could vouch for from direct experience. He had thought about it for 4 months. He had kept coming back to one name. "The Puppies," Marcus said, when Thomas had finished. Thomas looked at his hands. "They were here at the mine when I arrived. I don't know whose they were. Someone had left them in one of the structures. I think whoever maintains the archive used to shelter there. And when they stopped coming, the dogs were left behind. I couldn't take them with me if I was going to stay hidden, but I couldn't leave them either." He paused. "I know where your cabin is. I remembered your father's place from when you mentioned it, back when we were working together. I watched it for 2 nights to make sure you were the one living there. Then I came in through the window, and I'm sorry for that, and left the box. And I brought the dogs to your door." He met Marcus's eyes. "I needed you to find the code. I needed you to come to me, but I also needed the dogs to be safe." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, the memory card. Thomas reached inside his jacket and produced a small envelope. He held it out. "Everything I documented, labeled and organized. I wrote notes explaining the context for each set of materials." Marcus took the envelope. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of what it represented, not physical weight, barely any physical weight at all, but the other kind, the weight of a decade's unfinished work, of an investigation that had been walked away from, of justice that had been deferred, possibly by people who had reasons to defer it. "There are people in this evidence," Thomas said carefully. "People with authority. Some of them are still in positions where they can affect investigations. That's why I couldn't go through normal channels. I understand. You know, people who aren't compromised. Journalists, federal, people outside the original investigations structure. I know people," Marcus confirmed. He looked at the young man across from him. Still, young relatively. 31 was young when you were 61, and thought about the cost of doing the right thing when the right thing is expensive. He had thought about it many times in his career. He had watched Thomas Breck pay that cost once before. He was paying it again now, had been paying it alone for 8 months in cold and isolation, and fear. "You're coming back to my cabin," Marcus said. "Both of us are going to call someone I trust completely, and we're going to do this properly, together. You've been alone long. Enough." Thomas Breck looked at him with an expression that Marcus recognized because he had seen it many times over many years, across tables in interview rooms and in the faces of people who had been in difficult situations for too long. It was the expression of someone who has held something heavy by themselves and is finally, tentatively, allowing themselves to believe that help has arrived. "Okay," Thomas said quietly. They packed up the camp and walked to the truck through the snow. Chapter 8. The Reunion at the Cabin. Case and Ridge heard the truck from some distance away. By the time Marcus and Thomas came through the front door, both puppies had somehow exited the box. The physics of this exit Marcus chose not to investigate, and were positioned directly inside the door in the standard welcoming configuration of animals who have been left alone longer than they approved of. Thomas stopped when he saw them. It had not occurred to Marcus until this moment that for Thomas these were not merely two puppies he had delivered to a stranger's door. These were animals he had cared for, however imperfectly, through several weeks of cold and difficulty. He had fed them from whatever he had, which explained the undernourishment Dr. Okafor had noted. Not negligence, but genuine scarcity. He had kept them alive in conditions not designed for puppy survival. And then he had made the decision, knowing it was necessary, but presumably not easy, to take them somewhere safer. Ridge, the smaller, the one with the watching eyes, went directly to Thomas and sat in front of him with a precision and intention that suggested recognition. Then she put both front paws on his knee, which was as high as she could currently reach, and looked up at him. Thomas Breck, who had maintained his composure through a recounting of 8 months of fear and isolation in a stone shed on a mountain, crouched down and put his arms around a small brown and white puppy and lost his composure briefly and completely. It was private and genuine, and Marcus went to make coffee and gave it the space it deserved. When he returned with 2 mugs, Thomas was sitting on the floor with both puppies, investigating him with the systematic thoroughness of animals conducting an inventory. He accepted the coffee with a slightly self-conscious expression. "Her name is Ridge," Marcus said, sitting in his armchair. "His is Case." Thomas looked at the names attaching themselves to the animals he'd been calling. Nothing. Or maybe just the pups. He tested them quietly. Ridge, Case. The puppies looked up at their names. Good names. "I thought so." Marcus called Frank, who picked up on the first ring, clearly having been awake and waiting. Marcus explained the situation in concise and accurate terms. Thomas Breck, the memory card, the nature of the evidence, the probable necessity of going outside the standard channels. Frank was quiet through all of it in the particular way of someone taking careful mental notes. Then Frank said, "I know someone. She's a deputy U.S. attorney in the district, but she came up independently of the original investigation. She wasn't involved, no connection to anyone who was. She's been looking at the Branford Creek matter from a distance for the last 2 years, apparently. She'll know what to do with this." "Can you trust her completely?" "I've known her for 11 years, yes." "Then make the call." Frank made the call. The deputy U.S. attorney, whose name was Sandra Reeves, answered on a Saturday morning with the brisk attentiveness of someone for whom interesting cases override days of the week. Frank explained the situation. She said she could be in Ridgeline, the nearest town with an airport, by Monday morning, and that Marcus and his guest should bring the evidence there. Thomas Breck heard this and was very quiet for a moment. Marcus watched him process. The shift from 8 months of running and hiding and managing everything alone, to the possibility that it might actually be almost over. "What happens to me?" Thomas asked. "That depends on what's in this evidence," Marcus said honestly. "But someone who has protected material this significant, who has endured what you've endured to get it to the right people, is going to be treated with the seriousness that deserves. I'll make sure of that personally." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked down at Case, who was attempting to chew the lace of his boot with dedicated focus. He reached down absently and scratched the puppy's ear. "And the dogs?" he asked. Marcus considered this. "Currently they're in my custody. Dr. Okafor is their vet. Their names are Case and Ridge." He paused. "What happens with them after that is a conversation for another day, when other things are more settled." Thomas looked at him. "You'd keep them?" "I appear to already be keeping them," Marcus said. "Against my original intentions. That seems to be how these things happen." For the first time since Marcus had seen him that morning, something shifted in Thomas Breck's face, and a loosening, very small but real, of the particular tension that 8 months of sustained fear produces. He almost smiled. "They're good dogs," he said. "They'll be better once they stop trying to eat everything they encounter," Marcus replied. "But yes, Chapter 9. Monday morning in Ridgeline, drive down the mountain on Monday, was the reverse of everything Marcus had experienced coming up. The sky was clear for the first time in days, an enormous blue, uninterrupted by clouds, the kind of sky that mountain winters occasionally produce as, if an apology for all the gray. The snow on the road was packed and manageable. The pines cast long diagonal shadows across the white ground, sharp and geometric. Marcus drove. Thomas sat in the passenger seat with the memory card envelope in an inner pocket, looking at the landscape with the expression of someone who is seeing ordinary things with unusual attention, the attention of a person who has spent too long in one small space and is experiencing the ordinary world as remarkable. Case and Ridge were in the back, confined in a secured travel crate that Marcus had purchased from the pet supply store in Ridgeline on his way back from the Old North. Rode on Saturday. They had opinions about the crate and were expressing them. Marcus had turned the radio up. Sandra Reeves was exactly what Frank's description had implied. Competent, precise, and unimpressed by atmospherics. She met them in the lobby of the Ridgeline Mountaineer Hotel, the only hotel in town, functional and adequately warm with a bay, single assistant, a secure laptop, and the organized efficiency of someone who has done difficult evidence meetings before and knows that the quality of the documentation is what matters. Thomas sat across from her at the table in the small conference room and went through the memory card systematically, image by image, with the composed clarity of someone who has had months to prepare this presentation in his head. He explained what each set of documents represented, what the organizational structure of the archive appeared to be, and his best assessment of the timeline of the materials. Sandra asked precise questions and made precise notes and maintained throughout the expression of someone processing significant information without allowing it to affect her evaluation. 2 hours in, she sat back and looked at both of them. "This is substantial," she said. The understatement of someone calibrated to precise language. "Yes," Marcus said. "The question of how Mr. Breck's protection was compromised is going to be a significant parallel investigation." She looked at Thomas. "I want to be clear that your cooperation with this office, both past and present, is on record. Your status as a protected person was never legally terminated, regardless of what operational failures occurred. You were protected then, and you are protected now." Thomas received this without drama, but Marcus saw something shift in his posture. A very small change, but real. The physical language of a burden that has been slightly redistributed. "There are going to be proceedings," Sandra continued. Potentially lengthy ones. Several of the individuals whose materials appear in this evidence are currently serving in capacities that will complicate prosecution timelines. "I want to be honest with you about that," she paused. "But this evidence, if it holds under forensic analysis, and from what I'm seeing, it was documented very carefully, changes the landscape of this investigation in a way that makes the previous dead ends avoidable. We have a path now." She looked at Marcus. "Your role in this, Detective Sergeant?" "Retired," he said. "Your role, Mr. Cole. You're a witness to the discovery of the code and the location of the source. I'll need a formal statement." "You'll have it." She closed her laptop. "Is there anything else you need from this office today?" Marcus thought about it. Then he said, "Mr. Breck is going to need appropriate arrangements, housing, documentation, a situation that's sustainable, and he's going to need to know that those arrangements are real and monitored. The previous failure was a failure of follow-through. I'd like your personal assurance that what happens next has oversight." Sandra Reeves looked at him with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to being underestimated by people who didn't know her. "You have it," she said. "My personal overnight documented." They shook hands across the conference table. The puppies, still in their crate in the truck outside, were quiet now, which Marcus had learned over the past 2 days meant they were asleep. He drove Thomas to the temporary housing Sandra's assistant arranged that afternoon. A clean, secure apartment in Ridgeline, populated with enough basic necessities to be habitable and with a contact number that would actually answer when called. Thomas stood in the doorway and looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who has a great deal to say and is uncertain where to begin. "You don't have to say anything," Marcus told him. "I know." Thomas looked at his hands. "The dogs. I'm glad they're okay." "They're very okay." "Case has destroyed 2 blankets. Ridge has started responding to commands. Something that was definitely a real smile crossed Thomas Breck's face, for only the second time that Marcus had seen it. "That sounds right," he said. "She's the smart one." "I noticed," Marcus agreed. He drove back up the mountain in the long blue afternoon light, Case and Ridge awake, and watchful in the crate behind him, the mountain solid and enormous on all sides. The cabin came into view around the last bend and looked exactly as it always looked. Stone and timber. Lights on inside from the timers he had set before leaving. Smoke from the chimney. His father's place. His place. He let the dogs in first. They had been in the crate for several hours and had things to investigate. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. Case charging the living room at full momentum and immediately trying to climb into the armchair, Ridge, sitting in the middle of the rug and conducting a careful assessment of what, if anything, had changed in their absence. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door. Chapter 10. What the Winter Taught. The investigation that followed was, as Sandra Reeves had promised, lengthy. Marcus gave his statement, cooperated fully with the parallel review of the protection failure, and was called to Missoula 3 times over the following year and a half to speak with investigators, lawyers, and eventually a grand jury. He drove down the mountain, did what was asked of him with the professional thoroughness that had characterized his entire career, and drove back up, Thomas Breck testified. The testimony was not easy. Testimony of that nature never is, but it was thorough and credible and supported by 311 photographs that withstood every forensic challenge mounted against them. The proceedings moved in the patient, complicated way that significant criminal proceedings involving people with resources and lawyers always move, but they moved. The path that Sandra Reeves had described on that Monday morning in January proved to be real. Marcus followed it all from a distance, reading what was public, staying available for what was required of him, and otherwise living his life on Cascade Ridge. The life that had always been there, only fuller now in ways he had not anticipated and would not have chosen in advance and could not imagine reversing. Case grew into a 72-pound monument to enthusiasm. He had an inexhaustible appetite for activity, a complete inability to pass a stick without carrying it somewhere, and a relationship with the concept of personal space that could most accurately be described as theoretical. He was, Marcus had come to understand, exactly the kind of dog that makes you feel that something important is happening at all times, which is either exhilarating or exhausting depending on your mood, and which Marcus had. Determined, on balance, he preferred to its absence. Ridge grew into a quieter animal, though not a passive one. She was attentive in the way that some animals are attentive, the kind of attention that is not waiting for something to happen but actively processing everything that is already happening. She had a habit of positioning herself at the highest point of any room she was in, which in the cabin meant the back of the armchair or the top of the stairs, looking out at things with an expression of calm assessment. Marcus found this habit deeply relatable and appreciated it. He called his daughter Nora more often now. Not just Sundays, sometimes midweek. Sometimes just to describe something one of the dogs had done that was either impressive or catastrophic or both. Nora had visited twice, the second time bringing her husband and their 8-year-old daughter Petra, who had spent the entire weekend in a state of maximum happiness involving Case as her primary vehicle of joy and Ridge as her confidant. Petra had made Marcus promise she could visit again in summer. He had agreed. He had also visited Thomas Breck twice in the first year as the proceedings moved forward. Thomas was in a new situation now, a genuinely stable one, with Sandra's oversight proving to be the real kind. He was studying, working part-time, rebuilding the version of his life that the last decade had interrupted. He looked, Marcus thought, on the second visit, like someone who is not merely surviving but beginning to remember what it felt like to think about the future. They didn't talk much about what had happened, not in detail. They talked about other things, Marcus's knee, which had been surgically addressed and was improving, Thomas's classes, which he was finding more engaging than he had expected, Case's ongoing campaign to establish sovereignty over the armchair, Ridge's developing habit of bringing Marcus specific objects when she determined he had been sitting still for too long, a habit that Marcus had concluded was her version of suggesting he take a walk. On Thomas's second visit, he had brought something, a photograph he had found in an old box during his move into the new apartment, a photograph of himself and Marcus, taken by someone in the department during a long surveillance shift years ago, both of ye. Them in an unmarked vehicle, coffee cups in hand, looking out at whatever they'd been. Watching. Young, in the way that you don't notice you're young until you're not. Anymore. He had framed it, which Marcus thought was perhaps overly sentimental. He put it on the mantelpiece anyway, next to his father's photographs, because it was true. Chapter 11. A Morning in January. The following January, exactly 1 year from the morning he had opened his front door and found the world changed. Marcus Cole stood on his front porch at 5:50 a.m. with his first coffee of the day. The temperature was cold, but not the punishing cold of the previous year. 7 below. Perhaps. The sky was lightening in the east, that particular pre-dawn blue that exists for such a short time before the actual sunrise comes and changes everything. The forest was absolutely still. The mountain was vast and quiet and indifferent to the miner. Concerns of 62-year-old former detectives standing on wooden porches with coffee mugs. Behind him, through the door he'd left slightly open, he could hear Case doing whatever Case did in the mornings, which generally involved a tour of every room to confirm that everything was still in its place, followed by a visit to Ridge, who was in her preferred position on the back of the armchair, watching the window. Marcus breathed in. Cold air, pine, the faint smoke of the fireplace, the smell of a mountain winter, which he had learned over 2 years to appreciate rather than merely endure. He thought about what he had thought he was doing when he moved here. He had thought he was retreating. He had thought he was stepping back from a life that had consumed him and finding, finally, the silence he had earned. He had thought the cabin on Cascade Ridge represented a kind of ending. Not a bad one, just an ending, the closing of something that had run its full course. He had been wrong, or at least incomplete. The cabin wasn't an ending. It was a location. What happened in it was determined by what you brought to it and what occasionally arrived uninvited on your porch on a January morning when the temperature was 11 below. He had brought his history, his skills, his reluctance to ask for help, his tendency to work through problems alone, and his father's old book that turned out to be a cipher key. The January morning had brought him 2 puppies, a mystery, a former informant who deserved better than what life had given him, and evidence that a decade-old injustice was going to finally be addressed. None of that was what he had planned. All of it was what had happened. He heard Case pad to the door and nose it open further, settling beside Marcus's foot. With a heavy sigh of the early morning variety, Ridge appeared a moment later, moving quietly, and sat on Marcus's other side, looking out at the same view he was looking at. The forest, the sky, the first tentative gray-blue of a winter dawn. He reached down and rested a hand on each of them. Solid and warm in the cold air. Present. The investigation was proceeding. Thomas was building something. Sandra Reeves was, apparently, the kind of person who meant what she said about oversight and follow-through. Frank called twice a month now instead of once, and the calls lasted longer. And Marcus had noticed that he did not need to remind himself to pick up anymore. Nora was coming in March with Petra, and Petra had asked twice in advance whether Case had learned any new tricks, which he had, mostly inadvertently in several of, which Marcus did not intend to demonstrate on purpose. The mountain was the same mountain. The cabin was the same cabin. The coffee was the same coffee, and the morning was the same morning. And the silence was the same silence. But it held something different now. Not empty silence and full silence. The kind that has people and animals and ongoing matters and unresolved things and a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. And a dog who brings you objects when you sit still too. Long. The kind that is not the absence of the world, but the presence of a chosen corner of it. Marcus took another sip of coffee. Behind him, Case decided the morning had been quiet long enough and went back inside to investigate the blanket situation. Ridge stayed. She looked at the forest with her composed, assessing expression and occasionally glanced up at Marcus with the specific look she had developed over the past year, steady, patient, asking nothing, simply present. He could not have told you, a year ago, that this was what he needed. He would not have known to ask for it. He was glad, profoundly and specifically, that something, the cold, the storm, the thin sound of a puppy's voice fighting to be heard over the wind, had brought it to his door anyway. Chapter 12. Justice moves slowly, but it moves. 18 months after Sandra Reeves met them in that small conference room in Ridgeline, the first indictments came down. Marcus was at the kitchen table when Frank called. It was a Tuesday afternoon mid-March, and the snow on Cascade Ridge was beginning to show the first tentative concessions to approaching spring. Not melting exactly. Not yet, but softening at the edges, settling, losing the absolute authority it had maintained since November. Casey was asleep in the armchair. Ridge was upstairs. First three are official, Frank said, without preamble, because he knew Marcus would know what he meant. 2 former federal officials and 1 private financial intermediary. Sandra says it's the beginning of a longer sequence. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Breck knows? She called him before she called me. Good. He meant it completely. Thomas Breck had been the mechanism by which this evidence had reached the right hands, at extraordinary personal cost, after the systems that were supposed to protect him had failed. He deserved to hear about each development first. How's he doing? Sandra says he's okay. He asked about the dogs. This made Marcus smile. Ridge destroyed a throw pillow last week, he said. First time she's ever done anything like that. I don't know what it means. It means she's a dog, Marcus. It means she's experimenting. She's never been destructive before. I'm monitoring the situation, Frank laughed. The way he laughed when Marcus said something that was technically analytical, but was also obviously the behavior of a man who is deeply fond of his animals and is managing this fondness with characteristic understatement. There would be more indictments, Sandra had told him. The archive Thomas had documented was extensive, and the prosecution team was working through it, systematically building cases that would hold rather than moving quickly and building cases that might not. It was the right approach, the approach that the original investigation had failed to take, possibly by design, possibly by pressure, possibly by the ordinary failures of institutions under stress. The new approach was slower and more careful and more likely to actually mean something when it reached its conclusion. Marcus had waited 10 years for this to move. He could wait for it to move correctly. He called Thomas after he ended the call with Frank. Thomas picked up on the third ring, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has been sitting with large information and hasn't quite settled it yet. How are you doing? Marcus asked. I'm okay. A pause. I think I'm okay. It still feels I keep waiting for something to go wrong. That feeling doesn't disappear immediately, Marcus said. It diminishes. It takes time and evidence. He thought about what he had learned in the past 18 months about patience and evidence, about the ways things eventually arrive if you stay in the conditions that allow them to. But Sandra is the evidence you need for this one. She's doing exactly what she said. I know. Another pause. Marcus, thank you for going to the road that morning, for not just calling it in and stepping back. Marcus thought about standing in the trees watching the thin column of smoke. About knocking, about the pattern that only meant something to one person, about a man who had been alone for 8 months with a difficult secret and 2 puppies he couldn't adequately feed and a memory card full of evidence he couldn't deliver through any channel he trusted. You made it easy, he said. The code was good. The documentation was excellent. Thomas laughed, brief and genuine. You taught me how to document things. I taught you the principles. You applied them under very difficult conditions. That's yours. They talked for a while longer, about the proceedings, about Thomas's plans for the following semester, about the spring on Cascade Ridge and what that looked like. Thomas asked again about the dogs. Marcus described Ridge's pillow incident and Case's recent discovery that the back of the truck was an excellent place to sleep if one could get there without being noticed, which one had not been able to, but had tried 3 times. When he ended the call, Marcus sat for a while at the kitchen table with the last of his afternoon coffee, looking out the window at the mountain. The light was doing something interesting. The long, horizontal late afternoon light of early spring that comes in at an angle and makes everything look briefly golden and specific, as if the world is paying particular attention to its own details. Case had woken from his armchair nap and was watching Marcus from across the room, with an expression of hopeful inquiry that meant he had assessed the light and concluded it was close enough to walk time to begin making his case. Ridge had come downstairs and taken her position on the rug, equidistant between the fire and the window, which was apparently the geometrically optimal location. Marcus finished his coffee. He stood. He got the leashes from the hook by the door. Come on then, he said. Both dogs moved immediately outside. The air was cold but not brutal, and the light was doing exactly what it had. Looked like from inside, making everything briefly, precisely golden. The snow was soft, underfoot, and the path through the trees was clear enough. Case moved ahead at the end of his leash with the full-body commitment he brought to every, convinced, without reservation, that the most important things were always slightly ahead of. Wherever he currently was, Ridge walked beside Marcus at a measured pace, looking at the forest with her characteristic assessment. Marcus walked. He thought about the past year and a half. He thought about what it means to be useful at 62, about whether retired is a state or a transition, about whether the life you build around absence and quiet is the finished version or just the preparation for the version that comes after. He thought about Thomas in his apartment building something real. He thought about Sandra Reeves and the word she had used, path. We have a path now. He thought about 2 puppies on a porch in January, under 11 degrees below zero, breathing their shallow survival breaths into the dark of a winter morning. Everything, he thought, begins somewhere. Chapter 13, What is Kept? There is a question that this story invites, and it is worth pausing on. What is kept and what is lost when a life changes in a direction you didn't choose? Marcus Cole would tell you, has told people, when asked, and he is asked occasionally, now by people who have read about the case in newspapers or heard about it through the various channels by which unusual stories travel, that the honest answer is more complicated than it first appears. Things were lost. He would not pretend otherwise, though the specific quality of the solitude he had built in the first 2 years on Cascade Ridge and the complete autonomy, the predictability, the mornings that moved only according to his own schedule and his own mood, that was gone. Not replaced by something worse, not replaced by something he resented, but gone. You cannot have both that kind of solitude. And 2 large dogs and an ongoing relationship with a young man in Ridgeline and Sunday calls that have become Thursday calls and Wednesday calls and a granddaughter who asks about the dogs with a frequency that implies their welfare is a significant personal concern. These things don't coexist with the other thing. They are a different kind of life. But here is what was kept. Everything he had brought to that life. The discipline, the methodical mind, the patience, the professional skill that turned out not to have retired when he did. The capacity for loyalty, which had never actually gone anywhere, had just not had a particular direction for a while. The knowledge accumulated over 29 years of how to do difficult things carefully and see them through to their proper conclusion. All of that was kept. All of that was, it turned out, still in active use. And something else was kept or perhaps recovered. It was hard to tell which. A sense of continuity. The feeling of being part of something that connects backward into the past and forward into the future, rather than standing at a particular point in time, separate. His father had given him a book that became a cipher key that opened a door that mattered. That is not a sequence you could plan. That is a sequence that reveals itself in retrospect as the shape of something. Meaning is not a thing you find waiting for you in one place. It is a thing that is distributed through time and only becomes legible when you have accumulated enough of it. Marcus had accumulated enough. Ridge brings him an object every morning now. This habit has, over the year and a half since she began it, become one of the organizing facts of his mornings. He does not always know what the object will be. A sock, a piece of firewood from the basket, occasionally a book, once memorably his good hat. But the delivery is consistent. She approaches him while he is having his first coffee, drops the item at his feet with the demeanor of someone completing a professional task, and then sits and looks at him. With that composed, evaluating attention, he has concluded over considerable observation that the object changes based on what she thinks the morning calls for. Firewood when the fire is low. His boots when she has assessed that the weather is walk appropriate. The hat when it is cold enough for a hat. Whether this is actually inference on her part or whether he is applying patterns to random behavior is a question he has declined to resolve because he finds the ambiguity more interesting than either answer. Case remains case, boundless, cheerful, convinced of the fundamental excellence of existence in a way that Marcus has found over time to be less absurd than it initially appeared and possibly instructive. There is a version of optimism that is not naive, because it has no information about the reasons for pessimism, and there is another version that persists in the face of complete information. Case, who arrived half frozen in a snowdrift and is now 72 pounds of continuous enthusiasm, represents something closer to the second version. Marcus respects this. The Case, the one that bears the same name as the dog, which he finds privately pleasing, is proceeding. The indictments have continued to accumulate, slowly and carefully, the way Sandra Reeves said they would. Thomas Breck testified for the second time in late autumn, and Marcus drove down the mountain to sit in the hallway of the federal building during that testimony, not because Thomas needed him there, but because presence matters, and Marcus had learned that lesson the way you sometimes learn lessons, by first having failed to apply it, and then deciding not to fail to apply it again. He had sat in the hallway with a bad coffee from the building's vending machine and a book, not his father's book, a different one, and waited. When Thomas came out, he looked tired and present and fundamentally intact, which Marcus assessed as the best available outcome. They had dinner that evening. Yam in a restaurant in the city, the first time Marcus had been in a restaurant in several months. They talked about things that were not the case. Thomas was thinking about what he wanted to study longer term. He had ideas. Marcus listened to the ideas with the attention he brought to anything that mattered and said what seemed true and useful and refrained from saying what didn't, which is the only approach to advice that Marcus has ever found valuable. He drove back up the mountain after midnight in the dark, in the familiar truck on the familiar road. The cabin appeared around the last bend with its lights on, the way it always appeared now, because he always left lights on when he went out. Not for himself. He knew the cabin was there. But because of something he had thought about more than once since the January night when a family in some kind of crisis had looked for lights on in windows and chosen his. He leaves the lights on. It is a small thing and also not a small thing. It is an acknowledgement that the isolation was never as total as it seemed, that solitude and availability are not opposites, that the light you leave on when you go out is a signal to anyone navigating darkness that the cabin on the mountain is inhabited and its door might open to what arrives. He cannot promise what he would do with every knocking. He is not running a shelter. He is an old detective with 2 dogs and a bad knee, and a life that is fully occupied, but he leaves the lights on. Epilogue. January again. 2 Januaries after the first one, Marcus Cole opened his front door at 5:45 in the morning and looked at his porch. No puppies. No unexpected arrivals, just the cold and the dark and the snow on the mountain and the particular blue-black of the sky before sunrise. He stepped back inside, poured his coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. Case came padding down the stairs with the morning energy he brought to all mornings, landing at the bottom with more sound than was structurally necessary and immediately presenting himself for acknowledgement. Marcus rested a hand on his head without looking up from the table. Case thumped his tail against the floor. Ridge came downstairs more quietly and went directly to the window where she stood, looking out at the dark for a long moment in the way that she did, her breath leaving, faint fog on the glass. Then she turned, looked at Marcus, and went to the basket near the door. She selected a glove, one of the pair he kept there for early morning walks, carried it to the table, and set it precisely in front of his coffee cup. Marcus looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. She returned to the window and waited. He finished his coffee. He put on the gloves, both of them, the one she had brought, and the one he retrieved from the basket. He put on his coat, his face wrap, his boots. He got the leashes. Case was already at the door, composed for once into something resembling patience. He opened the door. The cold came in, but less brutally than it sometimes did. 8 below, he judged. Manageable. The sky was beginning to show the first line of gray-blue along the eastern ridge, the day constructing itself from darkness the way it always did, step by reliable step. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, fresh from the previous night, perfectly. Even no tracks, no arrivals, just the mountain and the quiet and the beginning of an ordinary morning. He stood there for a moment. The 3 of them, Marcus on the porch, Case already at the steps with full-body enthusiasm for the walk ahead, Ridge sitting just outside the door and looking at the forest with her particular attention. He thought, as he sometimes did in January, about the morning 2 years ago. The thin sound, the 2 small lives in the snow, the way a single moment of choice, going to the door, picking them up, not putting them back down, had moved through time like a stone dropped in still water, circles expanding outward in ways that could not be predicted from the center, He did not believe that everything happens for a reason. He was too old and had seen too much to believe in that kind of architecture. But he believed in this, that small acts of basic decency, of going to the door when you hear a sound, of picking up what is struggling in the cold, of keeping a light on, these acts have consequences that reach further than you can see from where you are standing. You cannot know all the things your choices connect to. You can only make the choices that seem right, with the resources you have in the moment they arrive. He had made the choice. Everything else had followed from it. "Come on then," he said, to the dogs, to the mountain, to the January morning that was beginning to brighten in the east. He walked down the porch steps and into the white. The light grew steadily behind him. The cabin, as always, was warm,